Okay, so as I say, great to have some of you guys back, and there may be some new maybe some new viewers. This time round, we're going to talk about smart low energy building design in the webinar, and particularly a term that I like, which is called getting it right first time. And so I'll go on to explain a bit about how we came about this topic. But fundamentally, this is a whole load of experience that I've gone on since being in the sector, and trying to, it's very difficult talking about it in 50 minutes, but we'll do our very best, leaving 10 minutes at the end for questions. But fundamentally, I actually wrote a book about this last year, and I'll come back to that. So the framework of this webinar is really around the kind of the chapters and the framework of the book. Obviously, in the book there's far more content, but this gives a really useful guide for you if you're new to it, or you're trying to learn a bit more about the failures of others and how to be successful first time around. I would just quickly start by saying at the end, we'll leave questions to the end. You should have in your Zoom box at the bottom a little chat icon. If you click on that, you get a chat bar on the right hand side. Feel free to put some questions up over the course of the webinar, and at the end I'll look down that list and we'll try and get some of those questions answered. So there's a little chat icon at the bottom. Feel free to just plug in your question, and so I'll look at it at the end. So to kind of kick off, as I say, there's a reasonable amount of content here. I don't want to rush through any of it, and we should be able to get through it in 50 minutes. But really, this webinar and the book, as I say, it's a kind of a playbook for the kind of structure that I think projects should take, and some of the key things that I think need to be addressed and haven't been for non-successful or less successful projects in the past. This isn't a webinar on building physics. We're not going to be doing necessarily case studies. We're not going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of numbers. This is reasonably high level, but very, very practical kind of tips on how to approach this and not make the mistakes that others have. A really quick introduction. Again, apologies if you've been on this call before, but just a quick intro for those who are new. Mesh Energy essentially is an independent energy consultancy practice. We're a new player, as you'll find out, to the design team, but essentially we're completely independent. It doesn't matter to us what the solution is, as long as it's right for the building and for the client. And really our primary aim is to simplify the growing and more confusing world of low energy and sustainable energy, and simplify what's being fed back to the design team, and really honestly trying our very best to make sure that money is kept, or wastage of money is kept to a minimum, and you meet all the various targets that you're trying to hit. And uniquely for a consultancy, we can offer kind of support at any project stage, whether that's pre-planning, after planning, through construction, and even kind of post-occupancy evaluation. So I won't linger on that, but that's a really kind of quick introduction to what we do. So to give a bit of kind of context and an introduction here to why I think this webinar is important, and why I spent a good few hundred hours of my life writing a book and scratching that off the bucket list, is, you know, kind of global pandemic to one side. We're in a period of very, very rapid change. The construction industry is changing rapidly. Manufacturing techniques are changing rapidly. You know, various, you know, decarbonisation of the built environment is changing. And whilst it's taken a decade to get to this point, we will see some even faster changes in things that we thought were going to be fast already. And to compound that, clients' desires are evolving. You know, the media now is covered with sustainability and carbon reduction, and, you know, talks of carbon and zero carbon and passive house and loads of other kind of coined terms. But now, particularly with the situation we find ourselves in now, the focus on the environment is really affecting everybody, and its effect is a global one. So client desires are changing very rapidly, and are really forcing professionals to learn fast and deliver against that. There's a number of big issues though which are causing pressures for design teams. One is simply information overload. It's kind of like mushrooming the amount of information that is available. And poor old, we deal primarily with architects. Poor old architects, are being expected to be jack of, a million and one trades. And some of these things need particular attention to be successful. And so that information can crush a project and skips, steps get skipped and missed and not done to the correct level of detail. There's also, I personally, and these are of course my own personal views, that there's still a big issue with collaboration and silo thinking in the industry. And I think that there's a big change that needs to happen with that to ease design team pressures. And if we can improve collaboration, ease pressures considerably on the wider team. But I'll go into that in the presentation. And as I said before, lots of products and lots of confusion. There's a lot of, you go to Grand Designs Live or EcoBuild or Future Build as it's now known. You've got an entire massive, rooms full of products and people trying to sell them. And there's a lot of pressure on clients and professionals just to, be sold to. And that can be putting the cart before the horse sometimes. And sadly, with all of these things taken into consideration, trying to fit a quart into a pint pot, there is, genuinely speaking, on projects, a lack of continuity, particularly when it comes to kind of low energy design. That's where projects fall over. Clients really with some amazing dreams at the start of projects, really just getting utterly frustrated with the way projects have gone. They may have wasted money. Their real enthusiasm has all but left by the end of the project. And most importantly to all of us, there's been a lot of money wasted. So that's, money makes the world go round, and wasting money unnecessarily because of, lack of due diligence is always really, really sad to see. So the whole point of us being more clear on what a successful framework looks like and some of the key things to focus on through some of the design processes and what goes behind great buildings will help us, reduce all of those things and really deliver far happier clients. So as far as this presentation is concerned, I've really split it into two main parts. There's kind of principles and fundamentals, and we'll have a look at energy basics, building a great team, or the A team as I call them. A bit about making and losing money on projects, goals and success. And the latter half is really about practical success tips. So we've got, the feasibility stage, kind of finding the right path. We've got specification, design, construction, and into kind of commissioning, handover, and in use. And then lastly, a kind of a final slide on some kind of key takeaways and trying to summarize what we've said and really kind of condense that into some main points. As I say, it's a lot to fit into 50 minutes, but a lot of this stuff is reasonably important. So I think this is enough without skipping over unnecessary things. So kind of first and foremost, when we think about kind of energy basics of a project, one of the things I wanted to get across to you guys was a change in thinking about projects. Historically, and for many years, construction projects and design projects have been quite linear affairs. And what I mean by that is, the architect and the client may have worked in isolation, and the client then entrusted to get something through planning. Maybe the structural engineer was involved at some very early stages. Beyond that, once planning had been granted, then the structural engineer would really do his thing and make sure that the building could stand upright and look like the thing that had been granted permission. And then, mechanical and electrical design would be done, the builder would be talked to, and then it would rumble up to construction. And that's what I'm talking about, a linear process, people kind of queuing up, doing their bit, passing it on to somebody else. And that's a broad generalization, but generally speaking, that's how a lot of projects have historically been run. Parallel thinking, which is needed for low energy and complicated projects, it is really about understanding, about having teams involved at earlier stages. So rather than the architect and client doing their piece, involving other individuals that are critical to giving feedback and developing the design, because decisions can't be made in isolation. And you will find in low energy projects that an assumption by one party may have quite a significant effect in you know, in another area. So these projects be parallel to be successful, and it means that a lot of thinking has to be done up front, which is a change in the way historically that projects have been run. The other key thing to kind of take on board here is not all parts of building design are equal. And what I mean by that, and this little graphic in the bottom right-hand corner, or to the right-hand side of the text, kind of suggests that. So we will all appreciate in a house that space heating and the energy you lose through roofs and walls and openings and floors and stuff are all different. And the energy usage for appliances is different from the energy it takes to heat the building. And even, you know, so you've got fabric elements, you've got technological elements, you've got other aspects of the build, and they are not equal. And to treat them as equal means that you know, you'll do a kind of a disservice to the proper design. And the next slide along will hopefully clarify how to deal with the more important aspects of the build first. And we call that we've called it the kind of the mesh energy hierarchy. It's essentially an evolution of some other energy hierarchies that you may have seen, but really prioritizes key things above others and gives you a structure for working down. And the other key thing to remember here is, much like, you know, I used a cycling analogy, and there are lots of different analogies for marginal gains and the compound effect, but essentially making small adjustments along the way, you will find through the duration of a project, and particularly at the early stages in design, they add up to a far greater, you know, result than the sum of the individual parts. And so you get this compounding effect, solve a whole load of issues.
But we can hear it.
It's got their mic not muted. Can they do that for us, please? Just got a bit of background noise. Georgius, have you got your mic not muted? Thank you. Thanks, guys. Yeah, so what I was going to say is, you know, these things compound up and can create massive benefits without, you know, really breaking the bank. And it's just about having a structure behind how you think about design. And this is the hierarchy I came up with, and it deserves a slide of its own because it is a very powerful, you know, powerful graphic. And in summary, as you work from the top down here, your opportunity is greatest to save energy at the top of this inverted pyramid. So when you start with any site, there's obviously, you know, usually restrictions about the site and potentially orientations of the building and what have you, but actually building or location, orientation, and particularly form of the building have a massive effect on how efficient it is from the very start before you think about other elements. And you know, I'm not so naive to think that every building is going to be subterranean and spherical, but it is worth bearing in mind that this top chunk of the pyramid, you can really make quite a significant impact, particularly between that and the next line down, which is about fabric efficiency. And if any of you are familiar with the Passive House kind of design principles of fabric first, that's exactly where it comes from. There's a very good reason why fabric of buildings are increasingly being more concentrated on, and more money is being thrown at the fabric of the buildings, is because there's an amazing opportunity there to reduce the energy requirements of a building hugely. I mean, you know, by, in some cases, 100%. And mixing that in with building location, orientation and form and fabric efficiency, you can do the lion's share of the work. Once you've improved to a high level the fabric of the building, air tightness and ventilation is where a lot of energy gets wasted. And again, without wanting to go into the detail, that's why you see mechanical ventilation and heat recovery and air tightness or infiltration values being really screwed down on high performing buildings. Because in modern buildings, if you don't do that, about a third of your energy consumption for the building's heating throughout the year comes down to ventilation. So that's why we've got heat recovery systems and stuff like that. So already we've talked about a whole load of things that doesn't include technology, and then you get on to technology, you know, but by this time the engine or the tech that you need to keep that building warm, and the energy that you need to put into that building to make it a comfortable environment, is far, far smaller than it would be if you just threw a big, ground source heat pump at the problem at the start. And getting this order right, and making your clients understand that this hierarchy is there for a reason, is really, really important. So, beyond kind of those energy fabric basics, the next really kind of critical thing is the A team, and obviously I'm not not talking about getting the AT sitcom back together, but what I mean here is understanding that having a great team behind a project can genuinely make or break the success of it, and that's not a statement that I say lightly. We've all been on projects where the team has let down the project, and hopefully we've all been on projects where a great team has really made the project something to scream and shout about, and create a great case study from. At the moment, as I say, there is the tendency for people still to work in their silos, and that can be designers, that can be architects, that can be structural engineers, that can be civil engineers, that can be a whole load of people across the design team. And generally speaking, that's not a good thing. That is not a good thing, and something that needs to considerably improve as buildings advance, because there's a lot, the problems are a lot trickier with low energy buildings, and with proper communication, those can be sorted earlier and far more cheaply. And the current project team, as we'd understand them, you've got structural engineers, you've got architects, you've got a project manager in most cases. You've got this kind of core team of individuals, which we'll all be familiar with. Now, what I'm trying to focus on here is really the new team that you should be putting together. And this is making some kind of tweaks as best as you can do, and just really highlighting some of the benefits of particular team members that you should be looking out for. And obviously a massively key team member is the client. So having an engaged client, low energy projects usually are driven by client desire, which is great. So usually there's a big tick in that box, but having an engaged client who's prepared to make decisions, listen to discussion, and progress is really, really important. Obviously having a disengaged client, we'll hope that you don't have disengaged clients, but it's really, really key and forms the foundation for the wider team. I've got having an enlightened architect here. So this is describing architects as, knowing their stuff. The fact that you guys are on the webinar today means that you want to be enlightened. You're on top of changing frameworks, how you can do better. And that really, when you engage with a client, that really comes across. You're not expected to know everything, but want to be, progressive and better yourself is no bad thing. Not every architect is like that. And that's why I say for low energy projects, it's really important that you are, and you're keeping up to tabs with what you can do, even if it's not what you do. A kind of a new member of the team, is independent energy consultants, or an energy consultant particularly. And this is really a kind of somebody that holds the baton through the project and can help at various stages, and ideally has some teeth. And what I mean by that is can help you with the number calculations, rather than just standing there and saying, oh yeah, it would be great if you could be sustainable, and you should be sustainable here, and you should be sustainable there. Actively working with the team to give feedback, to run modeling, and to help with every phase of the project. But at the very least, helping out at the front end with the design and making sure that's on the right track. A pragmatic structural engineer, so somebody again who's familiar with SIPS panels, with changing technology. I do feel for structural engineers, in as much as there's a lot of change structurally for buildings, and having an engineer that is prepared to take on that and deal with some slightly other tricky or alternative construction methods for buildings would really, really help you out, particularly if you're down the kind of the progressive end of building design. This is one I used to do project management a lot, and I think a superstar project manager, again, we've all been on projects where the project manager has been a godsend, and we've all been on projects where the project manager really is a bit of a waste of and looking for those superstars. Again, there's so many things happening in parallel, and with the detail of construction, that having a great project manager who facilitates that, is looking out for that on site, and is holding people accountable is really, really important for low energy projects. And then finally, a modern builder. So a builder who, you know, is progressive, isn't scared away by low energy buildings, what that means, and they can turn their hand, they've got experience and they can turn their hand to modern construction methods. Making and losing money. I tell you what, low energy projects, generally speaking, can be a black hole for money. People have poured so much money into low energy projects, is unbelievable. And most have done that and they still haven't been successful. There's a fantastic opportunity to waste money, not least because the technology and the building fabric and some of the products that are associated with saving energy can be quite expensive. And as a result, if the design isn't done properly and things are bolted onto projects, that can cause you know, a real issue with just budget. Just gets blown out of the water, and the scheme just isn't hanging together. And I proposed, and say, you know, definitely having a look at the book would help with this. I haven't got time to go into it, but what I did propose is, if you did have a budget for a project, assuming you had, say, a core amount of money for the project, but then the client had additional money or a proportion amount of money that they were prepared to make it kind of low energy, using that hierarchy structure that I was talking about gives you a golden opportunity to proportion where that money goes. So for example, you know, wouldn't it make sense, if you could make the greatest savings through the fabric of the building, to spend considerably more money on the fabric of the building rather than a gold-plated ground source heat pump, because they've got fantastic efficiencies. So being able to proportion your project budget against that hierarchy can really help as well. Also, I mean, given a lot of the negative press, one of the things that hasn't been massively promoted for low energy buildings is subsidies. You know, I know there's a number of people on this call who we've worked with, and government tax-free subsidies are still sloshing about. You know, there's a lot of money there for people who are making low energy buildings and embracing low energy technology. So, you know, there's tax-free money, it's there to be had, it's not particularly difficult to get, but again, requires some proper planning to get access to that. One of the battles though, and you may have this mindset yourself, guys, but particularly for clients who, you know, are writing checks for projects, again, it's a bit of a mindset issue here, because the spend on low energy projects is distributed differently than more traditional projects. And what I mean by that is, whenever you talk to people about low energy projects, they already have this thing's going to be a premium cost in their mind, and they're trying to save cost and try and bring it in budget. And typically the things that add I say cost, and they're rarely looked at as investments, but adding cost to a project are things like extra planning energy statements and SAP calculations, for example, that might be needed, or proof that it's a low energy build, early stage consultancy with specialist consultants, improved building fabric, which I've talked about, and also the renewable and kind of ventilation technology, which you know, can be considerably more expensive than fossil fuel equivalent. And the way to kind of understand this and describe this is, the aim of the game is to save money. And if you tackle things in the right order and the right design is done in the right order, these things become investments, not costs. And so the subtlety is they're there to save money, and can be done far cheaper in the long run and will reduce running costs, rather than seeing them as just an extra for the project and they're an unnecessary evil. You know, to get a low energy build, you have got to spend this money, but it's actually an investment rather than oh, okay, you know, it's going to add another 50 grand to the project, but at least I'll get a low energy project out of it. It's important to get your mind around that. And if you can get your mind around that, it becomes easier explaining it to clients. And this was just a kind of an additional piece here, which was just kind of show you the effect, just kind of graphically, of using this hierarchy and the effect that it can have on costs. So we've got this kind of schematic here, which I call the kind of the energy pie. So we've got building geometry, location, orientation, which changes the size of the pie. so does fabric element design and air tightness and ventilation. And if you get these things right in the first parts of the hierarchy, you end up with a far smaller pie, particularly when it comes to the energy that the building needs. And you can see the renewable technology slice, or the slice that would be needed to heat the building or provide hot water, is considerably smaller. And whilst this is a very primitive graphic, doing this right, you could easily get the heating costs of a building to the same or below what the hot water costs are. At the moment, a traditional build, the heating cost of a building might be 4 or 5 times what the hot water costs are. So using fabric and these higher tiers of the energy hierarchy can really massively reduce the spend and the running costs on the project. And this final section in kind of fundamentals is kind of really close to my heart here, because I've seen this be so successful on projects, and particularly Mesh Energy as a company. We have really focused on getting under the bonnet of how a client ticks, and maybe asking different questions, because we realize it's the key to unlocking a kind of a client's aspiration and helping the design process out. This isn't just some kind of ethereal kind of floating idea here. This actually results in practical benefits and cost savings. And you guys probably heard this before. This saying's been attributed to both Einstein and Ford, but essentially it goes something along the lines of, thinking is hard work, and that's why few engage in it. And it is true, thinking hard about why a client is doing something is tricky, and getting really getting into the nuts and bolts of why this project is why it is, either on behalf of the client or working with the client, does take thinking, and some of the thinking, given our busy days, can be swerved at our detriment. And what I'm talking about here, if any of you guys are familiar with Simon Sinek, for example, he's got this principle of the golden circle, and we relate that to construction, and you can do, a lot of people focus on the how and the what, but actually at the heart of that is the client's fundamental why. Why are they building a low energy project? And I've got a great graphic on the next slide which helps unpack that and explains why it's important, but also gives you a framework for walking it through with a client, because it helps the design team out as well as helping you understand. So other than clarity for the team, defining and measuring success on low energy projects is really critical. And this next statement, please just digest this, and I'll explain shortly. I would put money on every single project, or almost every single project, that you guys who are listening to us now, your projects are failures. And the reason I would say that, and this is the true for 99% of all the projects that are carried out, is success was never understood or defined. And if you can't define this as success, you can never achieve success. And it's always tempting as individuals or members of the design team to say, oh, that project was really successful, or that project was a complete failure. And we have our reasons for that. But the client, the most important gauge of success is the one that the client thinks is their measure of success. It doesn't really matter what we think is success. It matters what the client is, because it's the client who's going to give you that testimonial. It's going to be the client that allows you to take photos of their house. It's going to be the client that allows you to put a case study together and share that with your other customers, and so you win the next job. And so you deserve to, and the client deserves to, know what their definition of success is. And as I say, it's not just for their benefit, it's for the design team's benefit. And again, this is the kind of the structure that we came up with to help that. This isn't complicated, but it is, I hope, simple enough to talk through, understand yourself, but also talk through with the client. And so we start at the top, which is this kind of big why, which is this kind of emotional goal. And not everybody starts with this. A lot of clients start with this kind of guerrilla goal. And I'll explain that. So fundamentally, what you're trying to get to, and at the heart of every client's desire, is statements along this line. So when they're building low energy projects, they're talking about doing their bit for the environment, or responsibility to the next generation, or providing a comfortable environment for my family in, you know, in all seasons. There's something really kind of emotional there that really chimes with them. And that's really difficult, because that means very little to the design team at that stage. But it means something to the client. Where we often see goals start coming in on projects is at this mid-level. So these can be emotional, or they can be semi-measurable. And you will have had clients who will have said, I'd love to have a project that's totally off grid, or I'd love to build a passive house, or I'd love to build, you know, a grand design super eco home, whatever that means. And that starts to be a bit more concrete. And as I say, if a client starts here, you can go back up and you say, well, you know, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to be off grid? And start digging into the emotional bits of that, because that may unlock something else that hasn't been discussed up until then. And the important third step right at the bottom is this kind of grassroots goal and kind of measurable one. So this is really for the design team's benefit. So if somebody says, I want to build a passive house, or a certified passive house, that actually means, you know, that actually means something. You know, you've got air tightness values that you've got to hit. You've got building fabric efficiency values that you've got to hit as a minimum. Or somebody may say, right, okay, we've got to achieve a SAP rating of 100 or more. Or the client says, right, okay, we want annual energy cost to be below a certain value. You can start designing a building around that. Or maybe there's a budget that they don't want to exceed. That means something to the design team. And just in this single page, this tells you a whole lot. It tells you the whole spectrum, and gives you a whole load of information that you wouldn't have otherwise had. And as I say, a lot of this gets glossed over. And once you understand at the very top here what the definition of success is for the client, then the design team knows, and you can hope to achieve that by the project's end. So again, a really, really important kind of final thing to finish on there. So kind of part two, this is really more about practical steps through the construction phase. And again, this is based on, you know, over 300 projects. We see people making the same mistakes. We see successful projects getting a lot of these things right. And I want to share with you, none of this is kind of groundbreaking, but hopefully it gives you a new angle on it and a new view on it. So you can, you know, kind of improve and deliver more success for your clients. So the feasibility phase, we'll all be familiar with that. Loads of ideas floating around. This could be, you know, feasibility for anything, and particularly around low energy projects. Particularly, there are loads of ideas, and what you're trying to get down to is the ideas that should be chosen. And so I've said could versus should here. So how do you get from we could do 100 things to you should be doing 1 or 2 things? And that is the key goal of that feasibility stage. And doing that with confidence is really the key. If you don't figure that out, you're kicking quite a lot of risk down the road. And that can have some very, very detrimental, and going back to what I was saying about costs, some massively costly impacts as the project progresses. And on the next slide, I'll show you a graphic which captures that really, really well. So, I mean, we talk about in kind of Mesh Energy talk, we often talk about energy strategy. And for the bulk of our clients, energy strategy is where you start. Again, how do you shake down costs, benefits, options, explore things the client maybe hasn't thought about, and answer questions or debunk myths in bits that they have talked about or do understand. And the benefits of having a great energy strategy are putting the big questions on the table. The problem is if you don't ask questions, or the client doesn't ask questions, or they don't know what questions to ask and you don't help them, you can never discuss the answers. If the answers don't come out, they may be right, they may be wrong in whoever's opinion, but at least they're considered. And having this iterative loop of, we think this is the right solution for X reasons, and because you understand their big why and can start quantifying that makes far more sense. So you discover the optimal technology solutions, And you get far more financial clarity at some very early stages on in the project. You're not having to rely on installers' quotations, you know, at the tender spec stage to start filling in bits in your project budget calculations. And what I was going to say here, as I say, the whole thing is about a discussion document and not being afraid of spending more time at this stage. And we see that if you get this energy strategy stage right, one of the big benefits here for clients is they buy in, you know, they buy into what's happening. If questions remain, the longer the project goes on, the more flaky that the client can be as things get more serious and money gets spent. And then, you know, it becomes a bit more embarrassing for you as the design team to go back because you've realized you've made a mistake or something wasn't properly considered. Or maybe that's just off the table and you really have to break some really bad news to the client that was missed and you can't go back. So energy strategy is dead important. And the cost of all this graphic, this little sketch that we did is hopefully shows you again in really simple terms. And you will know this, you will know, you know, you'll be familiar with the trends on this graph. So at the early design stages, whether it's pre-planning, whether it's just after planning, you know, stuff is still just on paper. You can make decisions, you can make changes relatively cost effectively. You know, you can have phone calls, you can mess around to your heart's content, generally speaking, and it doesn't cost anything. Your options are very numerous as well, so nothing's off the table. And it's in these early stages that this feasibility is really critical and getting everything out on the table. As you start progressing to detailed design, it gets more pricey. You know, people are putting drawings together. Yeah, you know, time is being spent. You know, pre-construction things may be happening. And once you've broken ground on site, you know, the costs start going through the roof and your options dwindle to a very limited set. And this is why it's so important to do all your thinking at the front end and not allow it to kind of organically mature as the project goes on and on and on, because costs will just become, you know, crippling. And for many projects become really disappointing as an end result. It just doesn't seem considered. And the other graphic here is about kind of feasibility factors. So in the feasibility stage, again, hopefully this is a kind of a Venn diagram that makes sense, but essentially you're trying to balance up cost, site suitability of solutions and client desires and energy goals. And if you understand these three things intimately, through kind of proper analysis and questioning, it's very easy to find out where the sweet spot is in the middle. If you miss, you know, if you miss that sweet spot in the middle, you end up with, you know, the client either not caring or it doesn't really chime with them or something genuinely that won't work, or, you know, or you're blowing the budget again. So really the aim of the game is to find this sweet spot in the middle, which is the kind of the ideal solution. And this can be used across all kinds of things, but for low energy buildings, this, you know, when I think about all the projects, the ones that have been successful have spot on hit that sweet spot. So kind of moving on to kind of specification and tender. One of the biggest issues which we come across in the specification and tender process is that there's not enough specificity at the specification stage. With complicated buildings, low energy buildings, you know, whilst we try and keep them simple, as I say, there are a lot of services that interrelate, you know, services are part of main structures, etc., etc. These things are complicated. As simple as we try and make them, invariably they end up more complicated. And in order to control the specification and particularly the tender process, you've got to write some solid documents to make sure that the details are covered, the service locations are covered, and you know exactly what equipment is required, sizing, maybe even a kind of a brand that you're going for, so that when you go out to tender, it's far more under control. And again, I think a lot of our clients, generally get that, and it really helps you guys out as architects, particularly if you're managing the tender process, because it just means there's less faff when the tenders come in. And, you know, heaven above, you might actually be able to compare one tender with another. And if they're comparable, great. If they're not comparable, you can look at them against the specification that's been written and quickly find out whether things have been lumped in there in excess or missed out. And then you find out really whether something is good value or not. And as I say, that's really kind of a really critical step, and one that we see a lot of people embracing. And it really helps out. It makes your jobs considerably easier. The other key part to, you know, once you've written a kind of a specification and a proper tender document for, you know, heating technology, ventilation technology, whatever it's going to be, car charging technology, is finding great installers. And again, this is another kind of critical link in the chain. And I've got some kind of top tips here as to when you're looking for good suppliers, particularly when it comes to something as critical as the heating system and the hot water system and ventilation systems for a building. These are the things that really you need to tick off a fair chunk of them. Don't just Google ground source heat pump installers in Sussex. You're putting the project at risk, and all that good work that you've done, potentially, you know, with a good salesman, you could get thrown off at this stage. Leave yourself time and give yourself choice. You know, get 3 or 4 quotations in, particularly with the technologies being requested. You know, installers, you know, kind of the next level of installers, really low energy installers, and some of them, you know, do favor particular brands, and sometimes it does just take time to find the right installer. You know, referrals, as always, look at their experience and properties similar to the ones that you're looking at doing are really, really critical. There's no point in, or should I say, there's a higher risk, for example, if you're trying to do a refurb on a listed building and you're talking to an installer that's used to doing, you know, passive handling. So do bear their experience in mind, credit worthiness. And also, actually, another one which really comes across quite strongly, which we put there at the bottom, so it's last but it's certainly not least, is soft selling. You'll find a lot of, much like every other product salesman, hard, pushy selling is a big no-no. I mean, there's a difference between having passionate installers who really know their field and really want to see something succeed, and pushy selling and discounts and all that kind of stuff. And that's always a bit of a telltale as well. But primarily time and choice, as well as a couple of those others, are really, really important to get it right. If you find the right installer, so much hassle through construction. If you've got the right construction team, particularly if you get involved in project management, it becomes relatively a breeze. If you get it wrong, it becomes a nightmare. So onto construction and installation. I think there are a number of challenges which have become apparent, and if you can bear these in mind for your schemes going forward, I think it really sets you up nicely for, you know, just being prepared and making sure the team is capable of doing this and putting the structures in place. And what I mean by this is successful low energy buildings are all about the build quality and attention to detail. Once you're on site, the design be, you know, top class. You know, you've got the detailing sorted out from your drawings, you've got the structure sorted out, you've got service runs sorted out, you've got a whole load of design. But actually in construction, build quality, and particularly when it comes to infiltration rates and air tightness, you know, definitely build quality comes into it, and attention to detail. So making sure the details that you spent a lot of time drawing on AutoCAD or, you know, preparing the office actually get done, and those things aren't compromised on site. And increasingly there are, you know, kind of air tightness champions, or the project manager will take it upon himself to really pay a lot more attention to the detail going into buildings. And of course, you know, with off-site manufacture, there's the opportunity to have a lot of that detail sorted out, you know, in a factory off-site, so it's one less thing to worry about. And there are construction companies who will you pay them to worry about the detail, and they guarantee airtightness values, and you value performance and things. But also integrated service design. Again, goes back to this kind of parallel thinking thing. So how's the mechanical ventilation and heat recovery services going to work with plumbing and stuff? And again, you can plan this to the nth degree before construction starts, but actually how it's executed and really making sure that if there is a modification necessary on site, that you are on that, or somebody is on that, and the key team members are, are up to speed with what's being proposed. Things will always change on site, but it's how you manage that that's really, really critical. And then finally, their kind of workforce skill and mindset. We are seeing a real mindset change that the construction industry needs to see. Upskilling of staff, realizing that you can't just slap these projects together, and really, there's a lot more TLC needed. And again, choosing the right builder, if they've got the right culture in their team and they're managed properly, it shouldn't be an issue. But again, the wrong mindset, slapdash construction work can really let a fantastic project down if it's not being managed properly. And again, just generally, planning as much as you can do before you start on site, super communication during site. None of us like getting overburdened by endless emails and, kind of admin during construction. But it is really key understanding the supercritical links between changes. So for example, if something changed on the glazing, an energy consultant would want to know about that. For example, the structural engineer may want to know about that. And it's finding out who should know if certain tweaks get made to the buildings during construction, because making the assumption that it's only a small change can really bite you in the backside and has affected projects to their detriment. So as I say, nothing kind of magical there in construction and installation for low energy buildings, but particularly those few points that I've picked out are definitely worth focusing on. And then kind of into the final phase here for kind of completion testing, measuring and continued learning. I make a big point of this in the book, and it is, we are all guilty of this. We have a REBA framework here. I know it's recently changed, so some of this text may have changed. But we've got this, stages 6 and 7, which talk about handover to the client and close out and finishing commissioning and all that kind of stuff. And then post-occupancy evaluation. I mean, post-occupancy evaluation, again, in 99% of domestic cases is just not done. It's in there in the framework, it's just not completed. And loads of people come up with loads of excuses. Some may be legitimate excuses, others are just excuses as to why it's not done. And I think as low energy buildings evolve, we're really doing ourselves a disservice if we don't factor that in, but also do some better handover and close out of projects. So I'll just talk about those specifically and pick out a couple of points. So commissioning, often we put up with installers who send you a signed bit of paper to say, oh yeah, this system's been commissioned as it should have been done, and it gets filed somewhere, gets put in the handbook and plonked on the, maybe scanned and plonked on the client's desk when you're, finally shaking hands and saying goodbye. But actually commissioning, particularly where you've got a more integrated home, it may be that you need a more in-depth kind of framework for proving that commissioning has been done properly and that systems are working well together. And if this isn't done properly, again, the house could be built brilliantly. The system could be designed fantastically. But if the systems can't be commissioned properly, you undo a massive amount of work. And so just at this final little hurdle, you can really end up with a lot of client resentment. And sometimes it can be really tricky to track down because people start doubting themselves and people start pointing fingers. And particularly as low energy buildings are more electrified, with poor commissioning comes very high electricity bills. So you may be familiar with projects that have had high energy bills, and some of that will have been caused by poor commissioning. And so it's a really, really critical phase. As far as kind of handover and closeout is concerned, keep it simple. I mean, blimey, if ever there was a time to kind of keep it simple for clients, this is it. So everything's been done properly. we're not expecting, we failed as a design team if we're expecting the client to essentially be a NASA astronaut and twiddle things all the time to keep the house operating properly. That is not the aim of the game. The aim of the game is for them to maybe adjust a thermostat once in the blue moon, and the house just kind of looks after itself. And so keeping it simple, and first and foremost, just explaining to the client how the system works, the fact that they don't have to fiddle, that, you know, the house needs to settle in, things have been set up as they should have been done. And yes, it might take a bit of time to bed in, but don't go changing things. I mean, at worst case, they may uncommission something that was commissioned properly. So again, the proper framework for just, you know, a quick introduction, some setting their mind at ease, and giving them an idea of what they are allowed to touch to kind of keep headaches to a minimum. And then finally, kind of the in-use and kind of post-occupancy evaluation. I think we've all got to start doing something. And I was talking to some architects yesterday, and we were talking about this. It doesn't have to cost a fortune to get feedback. Blimey, I mean, you can have a phone call with a client after, you know, a year's up or 6 months is up, or after a hot summer, to find out how a building is doing. If they're not happy, they will contact you, but it would be nice if you could contact them, get some feedback, whether that's a simple form, whether that's just a conversation you make notes about. You can measure various things if you really want to. Of course, in the winter, you could do a thermographic survey, but, you know, you could do more basic stuff, just taking some temperature measurements in a bedroom in the middle of summer, or, you know, go back to the house and just see how it's going. But also, I've got compare there as well. So even something simple like just comparing energy bills. You know, this is the first step to figuring out what the performance gap is between what you thought the house should be and how it's actually performing. And the question you should be asking yourself is, what are you afraid of? What is the worst? What is the worst thing that could be said or that you could find out? And I would put money on the fact that actually it's not as scary as you think it would be. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. It doesn't have to cost the client a lot of money. But feedback could tell you something really fantastic and help your next project. You've got far more to gain.
Hi, Sachin.
And then finally, I mean, this is so important. I've
just got jumping on it. I was just
a few points here
and I'll come
to talk about kind of why we should measure and learn. Again, I won't go into these in mega detail, but it's all about improving design refinement. We have a professional responsibility to learn. You know, we have a professional responsibility to ourselves and our clients to better ourselves. You know, this performance gap thing is really, really important. For you to make sure that it's as accurate as possible at the start, and you can predictably know what's going to happen at the end. But also commercially, you know, there are business growth opportunities here. We're talking about, I mean, if ever there was a time to be more competitive and think about how you could be different from the competition, you know, getting that feedback and getting ahead of the competition and bettering our practices is really a massive opportunity. And this is the final graphic that I've got before we kind of go on to some questions. And this is, again, massively simplified, but this just gives you an idea between the curve or the learning and the knowledge in low energy projects, that the difference between architects that learn and compound their learning and architects that don't. So if you don't get feedback, you end up with this kind of sawtooth. You gain a load of potential knowledge through a project, but you don't really learn that much. There might be a couple of bits and pieces that you pick up or you could get better at. But architects that get that feedback can really accelerate away over a number of projects. And as I say, that has benefits both for the practice and you know, for the team, you know, wider team, and your projects and your clients going forward. You know, they benefit from your experience as well. So just a final bit before we have to talk about some questions, kind of key takeaways here. So focus on the fabric and the energy loss basics of the building. Get that energy hierarchy in your mind. Get under the skin with your clients and understand what that really kind of emotive goal is at the top, and so you can substantiate that for the project. Detailed design and tender, you know, really spend some solid time getting some proper tender specifications out there, so it makes the rest of the process easier. Focus on construction detail and particularly commissioning at the end to make sure that you know, the projects or systems are running as sweetly as they should be. And at the end, you know, get feedback and learn from the project. Even just doing one of those things on your next project mean that you kind of taken the first step. And that was the best way that I can summarize what we're doing in. So looking at questions here, let's have a look. How are we doing? So we've got from Ian, given your energy design priorities, I agree. So this is a question from Ian about does not list envelope performance at the top. Is fabric first a misnomer to the design and client teams? I don't. So essentially what we're saying is, why isn't fabric first at the top of the hierarchy? I think there's agreement that, you know, the form of the building should come before fabric, because there are other things that you can do about the siting of the building and orientation. But we hear about this fabric first term all the time, and I don't think it's a misnomer. I think the talk about fabric first, if anything, has done wonders for focusing people in on fabric. You know, for a long time, fabric was much further on down that list, and you know, people would just get away with what they were used to doing, what they were comfortable with doing. So I think fabric first is a great step there, and it has a massive impact on the energy usage of the building. But I don't think it's a misnomer. I don't think there's anything wrong there. I think there's just a stage above fabric first, which is just having a bit more of a clever think about the shape of the building, and maybe using natural features on site to benefit. Have we got any other questions? I think actually it's a bit light on questions. So if anybody else wants to put a question in the chat thing, or just quickly unmute your mic, feel free. We've got a few minutes, so don't be afraid to do that if anything springs to your mind. Stone silence. Okay, so what I was going to say, if nobody,
sorry, I've got a question.
Oh, sorry, yeah, go on. Is that Jason?
Yeah, hi there.
Hi there.
Is there a particular order to hierarchy of technologies that you would recommend for the majority of schemes? In
a word, no. There are technologies which kind of fuel type aside, for a given thermal output in kilowatt hours are cheaper. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you had to put a certain amount of kilowatt hours into a building, the reason that ground source heat pumps are talked about quite frequently is they are more efficient than air source heat pumps. So if your budget, you know, if you could spend whatever money you wanted to spend and you had a bit more money to put in a ground source heat pump, you would get better efficiency. So it can use electricity more efficiently than an air source heat pump can. So in that sense, capital expenditure to one side, you would put ground source heat pumps above air source heat pumps because the running costs of that technology long term are lesser.
Okay. And do you think
there is a way of organising it?
Fuel cells?
Sorry?
Do you think there will be a future in fuel cells for the majority of projects before long?
That's a good question. If I had a crystal ball, I probably wouldn't be doing this really. But I think fuel cells are an interesting one. I think there's a lot of talk about fuel cell technology, and I think you mean kind of hydrogen technology. Is that what you're getting? Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of talk about hydrogen technology. Again, without wanting to kind of get too geeky about it, there is a huge amount of energy that has to be expended to store hydrogen and actually produce hydrogen in any meaningful sense. And again, what isn't often shared is essentially the bulk energy density of hydrogen. So the amount of energy that you get out of a given volume is about a third of natural gas.
Okay.
So it's really tricky. You know, there's a whole, you know, billions of pounds and dollars and yen and stuff being spent on new technologies. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff being worked on. But at the moment, foreseeably, I can't see it challenging anything that we've got at the moment.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries. Anybody else there for a question? I'm just thinking, oh, here, okay, so we've got a couple more then. So let's just have a look. Oh, right, okay, so somebody's asking, so Alexander is asking about subsidies, these kind of tax back schemes, the RHI scheme. There is, so the best, I mean, I guess the best place to start for those schemes is really the one that's particularly meaningful is run by Ofgem. So the government body Ofgem. So if you type in Ofgem, so GEM, OFGEM, and the RHI, so it's the Renewable Heat Incentive, and there's a domestic and a commercial version. You'll find stuff on government websites about it, but also there's a lot of people that have done some really great kind of summaries. I think I've even written a blog on it way back when. But there's a lot of information out there. So it's the domestic renewable heat incentive or the commercial renewable heat incentive that you're looking for. Just doing a quick Google search. Thomas Elsmore asking about PHPP. That's really interesting. I mean, PHPP, so for anybody who doesn't realize what that acronym stands for, it's Passive House Planning Package. I think I've got that right. And historically, you know, Passive House has been the kind of the gold standard for low energy buildings. You're not just... And to my mind, Passive House has been great as a kind of a term. And yes, it's the kind of the pinnacle of kind of mega calculation, and it's very, very rigorous, and you've got to go on courses to become accredited and this, that, and the other. I think actually now the tools exist out there, if you find the right consultant, that will allow you to iterate your design to the same, really almost to the same level, at a far cheaper cost. The problem with Passive House is it's very burdensome when it comes to certification. And we find a lot of, speaking to a lot of clients, want to get 80 or 90% of the way there, but they don't care about the accreditation. It's getting to this sweet spot point where, you know, how much money do we spend to really break the back of this problem versus, you know, getting a nice little emblem that you can bolt to the front of your house. And I think we're there. PHPP is one of those mechanisms, but I think it's quite restrictive. And because the level of detail it goes to, it starts negatively affecting the form of the building. And so your end goal has a negative effect. And it starts compromising beautiful design, if that makes sense. So there are other things out there than PHPP. Don't feel that to create a low energy building, you've got to find a PHPP consultant and assessor, because the numbers start getting quite pricey. I think it's just unnecessary, but that's my personal opinion. The title of the book, somebody's asked, Jeremy, I'll try and hold it up here. So this is it here, Right First Time. It's on Amazon. What I was going to say though, which is very, very strongly related to this, I'm going to save you Googling it. We've got, so on the website, so if you go to our Mesh Energy website, you can download the free ebook. If you go to the architect section, there's a Right First Time book, so you can download the ebook for free. One of the things I am going to say to you guys is we love feedback, and one of the things, these webinars have been really, really successful, so we're exploring some other topics as well as getting feedback on the ones that we've given, and particularly today's. So what we're going to do is we're going to email you out a link, and that will take you to you'll get the presentation. We'll give you a link for this recording as well, so you can watch this back, but we'll give you a link to a quick 1-minute questionnaire. It's just 3 or 4 questions. And if you, in the comments section, which will allow you to talk about talks that you'd like us to do, if you put your address, everybody that gives us feedback, I will post you a book. So if you give us your address, I will post you a book. And what you also get to do is we've got 10 different topics. And so if you select those topics, the ones that you think are most relevant, basically the ones that are most popular, we'll try and present next month. So to see if we can get even more interest and make sure we're talking about stuff that you guys really want to hear about. So for the moment, I'm going to stop there. Thanks for your time, guys. It's